Have you ever found yourself drifting off to sleep with a rosary in your hand? Your prayers becoming more distant as consciousness slips away? That moment when your whispered Hail Marys grow softer, and your mind begins to float between wakefulness and dreams. You might feel a touch of guilt, as if you've somehow failed in your devotion by not completing your prayers in full attention. The rosary beads loosely held between your fingers as sleep overtakes you. It's a common experience for many devoted Catholics. Yet few of us talk about what happens in that sacred threshold between conscious prayer and sleep. What if I told you that this experience, far from being a spiritual failure, might actually be one of the most profound forms of prayer? What if Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the great mystic and founder of the Jesuits, saw tremendous spiritual value in this twilight state of prayer? The truth about praying as we drift into sleep reveals something extraordinary about God's presence in our lives. Something that transforms our understanding of prayer itself. The concept of praying the rosary while falling asleep touches on something fundamental in Ignatian spirituality that many of us have overlooked. When Ignatius of Loyola developed his spiritual exercises in the 16th century, he wasn't just creating a program of prayer and meditation. He was mapping the human soul's journey toward God, including those liminal spaces where consciousness meets subconsciousness. Many believers today think of prayer primarily as an active, conscious activity, requiring our full attention and mental effort. We've been conditioned to believe that legitimate prayer demands our complete awareness, that anything less somehow diminishes its value or efficacy. This common misconception leads many to feel that drowsy prayer or falling asleep while praying represents some kind of spiritual shortcoming or failure of devotion. Yet this view would have seemed strange to Saint Ignatius, who understood that God works in all states of human consciousness, not just in our waking analytical minds. Ignatius recognized something profound about human nature and divine connection that modern Christians often miss. In his autobiography, he recounts his own experiences of prayer in various states of consciousness, including those transitional moments between wakefulness and sleep. For Ignatius, these weren't moments of failed prayer but opportunities for a different kind of divine encounter. He understood that our relationship with God encompasses our entire being, not just our conscious mind. The Rosary, with its rhythmic repetition of prayers, creates a pattern that can continue to resonate in our subconscious, even as our conscious mind begins to rest. This continuation of prayer beyond consciousness speaks to the depth of how prayer can permeate our entire being. Ignatius would have recognized this as an extension of what he called finding God in all things, including all states of our consciousness. The implications of this understanding transform how we might approach those nighttime rosaries that so often end in sleep rather than completion. Consider what happens physiologically and spiritually when you pray the rosary as you're falling asleep. Your breathing slows, your body relaxes, and your mind gradually releases its grip on conscious thought. The repetitive nature of the rosary creates a gentle rhythm that accompanies this natural transition. Rather than seeing this as a failure to complete your prayers, Ignatius would have viewed it as a surrender of a different kind, a letting go that allows God's presence to work in the deeper regions of your being. In the spiritual exercises, Ignatius emphasizes the importance of what he calls application of the senses in prayer, engaging not just our intellect, but our entire sensory and emotional experience. This holistic approach to prayer recognizes that God communicates with us through multiple channels, not just through our conscious reasoning. The drowsy state between wakefulness and sleep actually creates a unique opportunity for this kind of sensory receptivity, when our usual mental defenses and analytical processes are quieted. Let me pause for a moment and connect with you more personally. Have you ever experienced that peculiar guilt when you realize you've fallen asleep while praying? That feeling that somehow you've let God down by not remaining alert and attentive throughout your devotions? If you're nodding right now, I invite you to share in the comments with the words, "I surrender in prayer." And if you feel comfortable, briefly describe your experience of praying while drifting to sleep. Your comment might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear to release their own feelings of inadequacy about their prayer life. Sometimes, the greatest comfort comes from knowing we're not alone in our spiritual experiences, and that what we perceived as failure might actually be a deeper form of surrender to God's presence. The historical context of Ignatius's life gives us important insights into how he might have viewed the practice of praying while falling asleep. Born in 1491 in the Basque region of Spain, Ignatius began his adult life as a soldier, not a saint. His transformation began during a long recovery from battle wounds, where he experienced profound spiritual awakening while reading the only books available to him, the life of Christ and stories of the saints. During this period of forced inactivity and pain, Ignatius learned to pay attention to his interior movements, the shifting states of his consciousness, and how God seemed to communicate through them. This attentiveness to all states of awareness became central to his spiritual teaching. In developing the spiritual exercises, Ignatius created a framework for prayer that acknowledges the value of different states of consciousness in our relationship with God. The theological underpinnings of Ignatian spirituality help us understand why praying as we fall asleep might be spiritually significant rather than spiritually lacking. Ignatius emphasized what he called contemplation, which isn't just intellectual consideration but a form of prayer that engages our imagination, emotions, and senses. He believed that God communicates with us through all these channels. When we pray the Rosary while falling asleep, we enter a state where our imagination becomes more fluid, our emotional defenses lower, and our senses take on a different quality of receptivity. From an Ignatian perspective, this state doesn't diminish prayer, but potentially enhances certain aspects of it. The Rosary itself, with its combination of vocal prayer and meditation on the mysteries of Christ's life, aligns perfectly with Ignatius's approach to prayer as a multidimensional engagement with God. There's also something profoundly countercultural in Ignatius's potential view of sleep prayer that challenges our modern obsession with productivity and measurable outcomes. In today's world, we often evaluate activities, including spiritual ones, by their visible results or completion metrics. Did I finish all the decades of the Rosary? Did I stay awake for the entire prayer? These metrics reflect our performance-oriented culture more than authentic spirituality. Ignatius would likely have questioned this approach. For him, the value of prayer wasn't in its completion, but in its sincerity and openness to God. The person who falls asleep while praying might actually be demonstrating a deeper trust, a willingness to be vulnerable before God. There's a beautiful surrender in allowing yourself to drift into sleep while in conversation with God, like a child falling asleep in a parent's arms mid-conversation. This image captures something essential about our relationship with God that our achievement-oriented approach to spirituality often misses. The Ignatian practice of discernment of spirits offers another lens through which to understand the value of Rosary prayer during the transition to sleep. Ignatius taught that we can experience different spiritual movements, interior impulses, thoughts, and feelings that either draw us toward God or away from God. He called these movements consolation and desolation. The state between wakefulness and sleep can be a unique time to notice these movements when our usual mental filters and defenses are lowered. Many people report that insights or clarity about spiritual matters often emerge during this transitional state. The rhythmic nature of the Rosary creates a backdrop against which these interior movements can be perceived more clearly. Ignatius would likely have seen this twilight state not as compromised prayer, but as a potentially fertile ground for a different kind of spiritual awareness and discernment. The Rosary itself has a special connection to sleep and dreams in Catholic tradition that aligns with Ignatian spirituality. Throughout history, many saints and ordinary believers have reported significant dreams or spiritual experiences that occurred after falling asleep while praying the Rosary. These accounts suggest that the prayer continues to work in some mysterious way, even as consciousness fades. In his letters, Ignatius often encouraged his followers to pay attention to their dreams and the thoughts that arise upon waking, seeing these as potential channels for divine communication. While he would have cautioned against overinterpreting dreams or giving them undue importance, he recognized that God can speak to us through all aspects of our experience, including our sleep. The practice of falling asleep with the Rosary creates an intentional spiritual context for this potential communication. From a practical perspective, the Ignatian approach to prayer offers several insights for those who regularly find themselves falling asleep during nighttime Rosary prayer. First, Ignatius would likely encourage us to let go of guilt about this experience. If our intention is sincere, then surrendering to sleep while in prayer can be understood as an act of trust rather than failure. Second, he might suggest setting an intention before beginning the Rosary, acknowledging the possibility of falling asleep and offering that potential sleep as part of the prayer itself. Third, in keeping with his emphasis on reflection, he might recommend taking a moment in the morning to notice any insights or feelings that emerge after a night that began in prayer. These practical applications transform what might seem like incomplete prayer into a more integrated spiritual practice that spans different states of consciousness. The concept of finding God in all things, one of the central principles of Ignatian spirituality, provides perhaps the most compelling framework for understanding the value of praying as we fall asleep. This principle reminds us that God's presence isn't limited to formal prayer times or conscious religious activities, but permeates every aspect of our existence. Sleep, which occupies roughly a third of our lives, is certainly included in all things. By beginning our sleep with prayer, we symbolically and practically invite God's presence into this significant portion of our existence. The Rosary, carried into sleep, becomes a thread that connects our conscious devotion with the mysterious realm of sleep, ensuring that our relationship with God encompasses our whole being, not just our waking hours. This holistic approach to spirituality is quintessentially Ignatian and offers a powerful reframing of what it means to fall asleep in prayer. Ignatius also emphasized the importance of desire in prayer. He believed that our deepest desires, when properly oriented, reflect God's desires for us. Even when our conscious mind fails to complete a prayer, the desire that initiated it remains spiritually significant. In his spiritual exercises, Ignatius writes about the importance of asking for what we want in prayer. This asking isn't just about the words we say, but about the desires that motivate our prayer. When someone begins the Rosary before sleep, their desire to commune with God and honor Mary is already a spiritual reality, regardless of whether sleep intervenes before the final decade. This perspective offers comfort to those who worry about the incompleteness of their drowsy prayers, reminding us that God responds to the heart's desire, even when our human limitations prevent full expression of that desire. To understand how Ignatius might view the practice of praying the Rosary while falling asleep, it's helpful to look at how he approached the concept of time in prayer. Unlike some spiritual traditions that emphasize extended hours of formal prayer, Ignatius was remarkably practical and flexible. He recognized that the quality of prayer matters more than its duration. In his guidelines for the spiritual exercises, he often suggests adapting the length and timing of prayer according to the individual's circumstances and capacity. This adaptability reflects Ignatius's understanding that spiritual life must be integrated into the realities of human existence, including our need for rest. Far from seeing sleep as an interruption of prayer, he might have viewed the movement from conscious prayer into sleep as a natural transition that God can use for continuing spiritual work in the person. The Ignatian concept of contemplation in action also illuminates how we might understand prayer that extends into sleep. This principle suggests that prayer isn't just what happens during designated prayer times, but can infuse all our activities. Just as work can become prayer when done with the right intention, perhaps sleep too can become prayer when it begins in devotion. The Rosary, carried from wakefulness into sleep, exemplifies this integration of prayer into the natural rhythms of human life. Rather than compartmentalizing spirituality as something that happens only in church or during conscious prayer times, this approach recognizes God's presence and work in all aspects of our existence, including our sleep. This integration of prayer and life is one of Ignatius's most enduring spiritual insights and offers a compassionate framework for understanding sleep prayer. Saint Ignatius's own prayer practices, as recorded in his spiritual diary, reveal someone who paid careful attention to different states of consciousness in prayer. He often noted the tears, consolations, and interior movements that occurred during his prayer times, indicating an awareness of prayer as an experience that encompasses more than just the conscious mind. While he certainly valued alert, focused prayer, his writings suggest an openness to how God might work through various states of awareness. Ignatius was also known to pray late into the night and early in the morning, suggesting that he too experienced the intersection of prayer and sleep. His personal practice seemed to embrace the full range of human experience as potential ground for divine encounter, an approach that would naturally include those drowsy prayers that so often cause unnecessary guilt for contemporary believers. The Ignatian approach to imagination in prayer also helps us understand the potential value of Rosary prayer as we fall asleep. Ignatius encouraged the use of imagination as a way to enter more fully into biblical scenes and spiritual truths. The state between wakefulness and sleep is often characterized by increased imaginative activity, making it potentially fertile ground for this kind of prayer. Many people report that the mysteries of the Rosary become more vivid and immediate in this drowsy state, allowing for a different quality of contemplation than might be possible in full wakefulness. Rather than seeing the dreamlike quality of drowsy prayer as a distraction or failure, Ignatius might have recognized it as an opportunity for the imagination to engage with sacred realities in a unique way. There's a fascinating connection between Ignatian prayer and modern understanding of how the brain works during the transition to sleep. Neuroscience has identified several brain states that occur as we fall asleep, including hypnagogia, the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep. During this state, the brain exhibits increased theta wave activity, which is associated with deep meditation and creativity. Some researchers suggest that this state allows for unique forms of insight and connection making. From a neuroscientific perspective, praying during this transition might actually facilitate certain kinds of spiritual awareness that are less accessible during full wakefulness. While Ignatius obviously didn't have access to this scientific understanding, his experiential approach to prayer seemed to intuitively recognize the spiritual potential of different states of consciousness, including the approach to sleep. The spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius include a practice called the application of the senses, where the person praying is invited to engage imaginatively with a gospel scene using all 5 senses. What would they see, hear, smell, taste, and feel if present at the event? This multisensory engagement creates a rich, immersive form of prayer that goes beyond intellectual understanding. The state between wakefulness and sleep, when sensory boundaries often become more fluid, can be particularly conducive to this kind of prayer. Many people report that the Rosary mysteries become more sensorially vivid as they drift toward sleep, allowing for a deeper experiential engagement with the events of Christ's life. This suggests that falling asleep while praying the Rosary, rather than being a failure, might actually facilitate certain aspects of prayer that Ignatius particularly valued. It's worth noting that Ignatius's approach to sleep and prayer stands in contrast to certain other spiritual traditions that emphasize vigilance and the conquest of sleep. In some ascetic traditions, the ability to remain awake in prayer was seen as a sign of spiritual advancement, and falling asleep was viewed as a weakness to be overcome. Ignatius, while certainly valuing attentiveness in prayer, took a more balanced and compassionate view of human limitations. His spirituality consistently emphasizes working with rather than against our human nature, finding God within the realities of embodied human experience rather than trying to transcend them entirely. This balanced approach offers reassurance to those who regularly fall asleep during prayer, suggesting that God meets us within our human limitations rather than demanding we overcome them before true prayer can happen. There's a beautiful parallel between the practice of falling asleep while praying the Rosary and the Christian understanding of death as falling asleep in Christ. Throughout Christian tradition, sleep has been understood as a metaphor for death, and waking as a metaphor for resurrection. When we pray as we fall asleep, we symbolically entrust ourselves to God in a way that prefigures our final surrender in death. The Rosary, with its focus on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, as well as Mary's role in salvation history, provides a particularly appropriate content for this practice. By falling asleep with these sacred mysteries in our minds and hearts, we rehearse a fundamental Christian truth that in both sleep and death, we remain in God's presence and care. Ignatius, with his emphasis on finding God in all things, would likely have appreciated this symbolic dimension of sleep prayer. For those who struggle with insomnia or anxiety about sleep, the Ignatian perspective on praying the Rosary while falling asleep offers practical spiritual help. By reframing this experience as a valid and valuable form of prayer rather than a failure, it removes one source of sleep anxiety, the fear of wasting time or failing God if sleep comes during prayer. Ignatius's emphasis on freedom from disordered attachments, including attachment to particular forms or outcomes in prayer, encourages a more peaceful approach to nighttime devotion. The person who begins the Rosary with the understanding that falling asleep in prayer is itself a form of holy surrender may find that both their prayer life and their sleep quality improve. This practical benefit reflects Ignatius's general approach to spirituality, which consistently aims to help people live more integrated, peaceful lives in relationship with God. The particular structure of the Rosary makes it especially suitable for prayer that transitions into sleep. The repetitive nature of the Hail Marys creates a gentle rhythm that can accompany the natural slowing of breath and thought as sleep approaches. The mysteries, contemplated in sequence, provide a narrative structure that can engage the imagination in a guided way even as consciousness begins to fade. This combination of rhythm and narrative makes the Rosary uniquely adaptable to the transition from wakefulness to sleep. Ignatius, who appreciated the value of structure and method in prayer while remaining flexible about their application, would likely have seen how well the Rosary's format accommodates this liminal state. The Rosary becomes not just a prayer to be completed before sleep, but a prayer that can accompany us into sleep itself. Saint Ignatius's teachings about consolation and desolation offer another valuable perspective on praying while falling asleep. Ignatius described consolation as an experience of increasing faith, hope, and love, a sense of God's presence and peace. Desolation, by contrast, involves feelings of distance from God, spiritual darkness, or turmoil. Many people report that beginning the Rosary as they prepare for sleep helps create a sense of consolation, regardless of whether they remain awake to complete it. The peaceful rhythm of the prayers, the focus on sacred mysteries, and the intentional turning toward God often generate feelings of comfort and security that persist even as consciousness fades. From an Ignatian perspective, this consolation is a significant spiritual fruit, independent of whether every decade is consciously completed. The Ignatian emphasis on freedom offers yet another framework for understanding the value of Rosary prayer that continues into sleep. For Ignatius, spiritual freedom meant being detached from anything that might prevent us from responding fully to God's love and invitation. This included detachment from rigid ideas about how prayer should look or what constitutes successful prayer. The person who can peacefully allow their Rosary to become a bridge into sleep, without anxiety about completion or performance, demonstrates a kind of spiritual freedom that Ignatius would have valued. They are free from the compulsion to control their spiritual life according to external metrics and able to trust God's work even in unconsciousness. This freedom represents spiritual maturity rather than spiritual failure. Ignatian spirituality emphasizes the importance of reflection, the practice of looking back on experience to discern God's presence and action. This practice can be particularly valuable for those who regularly fall asleep while praying the Rosary. Taking a moment upon waking to notice any dreams, insights, or feelings that might have emerged during sleep initiated in prayer can reveal unexpected spiritual fruits. Many people report that when they fall asleep while praying the Rosary, their dreams often have a more peaceful or meaningful quality, or they wake with insights related to what they were praying about. Ignatius would likely have encouraged attention to these experiences as potential signs of how God continues to work in us, even during sleep. This reflective practice transforms what might seem like failed prayer into part of an ongoing dialogue with God that spans different states of consciousness. Let's consider some practical applications of these Ignatian insights for those who regularly pray the Rosary at bedtime. First, you might begin with a brief prayer of intention, acknowledging the possibility of falling asleep and offering that sleep itself as part of your prayer. Second, consider selecting just one mystery to focus on particularly, knowing that even if you don't complete all decades, you've engaged meaningfully with part of the Rosary. Third, try keeping a small journal by your bed to note any insights or experiences that seem connected to your night prayers. This reflection is itself a valuable spiritual practice from an Ignatian perspective. Fourth, release any guilt about falling asleep in prayer, recognizing that this natural transition can be embraced rather than resisted as part of your spiritual life. These practical steps transform drowsy Rosary prayer from a source of guilt into an integrated spiritual practice. There's a profound connection between the Rosary prayer that extends into sleep and the Ignatian understanding of love. For Ignatius, love is shown more in deeds than in words, and one of the deepest expressions of love is trust. When we allow ourselves to fall asleep while praying, we demonstrate a fundamental trust in God's continuing presence and care, even when our conscious mind is no longer actively engaged. There's something beautifully vulnerable about this surrender, like a child falling asleep in a parent's arms. This image of childlike trust reflects Jesus' own teaching that we must become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. The willingness to fall asleep in prayer, without anxiety about completing every word, can thus be understood as an expression of loving trust rather than spiritual negligence. Ignatius's understanding of the exam prayer, a daily reflective prayer he considered essential, offers another perspective on the value of Rosary prayer that extends into sleep. The exam involves reviewing the day with gratitude, paying attention to emotions, choosing one feature of the day to pray from, looking toward tomorrow, and closing with conversation with God. This structure creates a natural bridge from the activities of the day into restful sleep. Similarly, the Rosary can serve as a bridge, helping us transition from the concerns and activities of waking life into the surrender of sleep. Both practices help us integrate our spiritual awareness with the natural rhythms of daily life, including the rhythm of wakefulness and sleep. This integration of prayer with life's natural patterns reflects Ignatius's incarnational spirituality, which sees God at work within, not separate from, the realities of human existence. For those who worry about the obligation aspect of the Rosary, especially if they've committed to pray it daily, but often fall asleep before completion, Ignatian spirituality offers a liberating perspective. Ignatius consistently emphasized that spiritual practices are means, not ends. They exist to facilitate a loving relationship with God, not as obligations to be fulfilled for their own sake. The person who begins the Rosary with sincere devotion but falls asleep during the prayer has already accomplished the essential purpose, finding a way to open themselves to God's presence. Ignatius would likely have cautioned against allowing anxiety about completing the Rosary to overshadow the peace and connection it's meant to foster. This perspective frees us from scrupulosity about formal completion, while honoring the genuine spiritual value of the practice. The Ignatian principle of cura personalis, or care for the whole person, also informs how we might understand the practice of praying while falling asleep. This principle recognizes that spiritual growth must take into account the individual's physical, emotional, and psychological realities. The need for sleep is a fundamental aspect of our embodied existence, not a weakness to be overcome or ignored. By allowing prayer to accompany us into sleep, rather than seeing sleep as an interruption of prayer, we honor this holistic understanding of human nature. This approach acknowledges that God works with us as we are, within the realities of our embodied lives, not in spite of them. The Rosary that extends into sleep thus becomes an expression of integrated spirituality, rather than a compromise or failure. The Ignatian concept of indifference, not apathy, but a state of interior freedom, also illuminates the spiritual value of falling asleep in prayer. Ignatius taught that we should aim for a state of balance where we're not unduly attached to any particular outcome, but open to however God might work in a situation. Applied to prayer, this suggests that we shouldn't be rigidly attached to completing the Rosary in a particular way, but open to how God might use our prayer intention even if sleep intervenes. The person who can begin the Rosary with devotion and then surrender peacefully to sleep without anxiety about finishing demonstrates this kind of healthy spiritual indifference. They're attached to the relationship with God that the prayer expresses, not to the specific form the prayer takes, reflecting a mature spirituality that Ignatius would have affirmed. For those who practice the Rosary while falling asleep, the Ignatian tradition offers several saints whose experiences might provide inspiration and reassurance. Saint Bernadette Soubirous, to whom the Virgin Mary appeared at Lourdes, was known to fall asleep while praying the Rosary. When asked if this bothered her, she reportedly replied that a child often falls asleep in its mother's arms, and the mother continues to love the child during its sleep. This beautiful image captures something essential about how God might view our sleepy prayers. Similarly, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, whose Little Way emphasized childlike trust in God's love, wrote about her own experiences of drowsiness during prayer, without a sense that this diminished the prayer's value. These saints, whose spirituality resonates with Ignatian principles, offer models of how sleep and prayer can be understood as compatible rather than opposed. As we near the end of our exploration of the silent Rosary prayer during sleep and Ignatian spirituality, I want to emphasize how this understanding can transform our nighttime prayer practice. Rather than approaching the bedtime Rosary with anxiety about staying awake or completing every decade, we can embrace it as a unique form of prayer that honors both our devotion and our human need for rest. We can recognize that the boundaries between prayer and sleep aren't as rigid as we might have thought, that God's presence continues to work in us even as consciousness fades. This perspective frees us from unnecessary guilt and opens us to a more integrated understanding of how prayer permeates all aspects of our being, including our sleep. The Rosary becomes not just a prayer we say before sleep, but a prayer that accompanies us into sleep itself, continuing to work in mysterious ways beyond our conscious awareness. If these reflections on praying the Rosary while falling asleep and Saint Ignatius's spiritual wisdom have touched something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, where we explore together the deeper dimensions of Catholic spirituality. Each week, we delve into teachings that help us find God in all aspects of our lives, including those we might have overlooked or misunderstood. You're not alone in seeking a more authentic and integrated spiritual life. Many of us are on this journey together, trying to understand how ancient wisdom speaks to our contemporary experiences. By subscribing, you'll join a community of fellow seekers exploring these sacred truths together. Thank you for spending this time in reflection. Your presence here is already a sign of your genuine desire for deeper connection with God. In conclusion, the silent rosary prayer that accompanies us into sleep, far from being a spiritual failure, can be understood as a profound expression of trust and surrender when viewed through the lens of Ignatian spirituality. Saint Ignatius's holistic approach to prayer, his emphasis on finding God in all things, and his understanding of how God works through different states of consciousness all suggest that drowsy prayer has its own unique spiritual value. The rosary that begins in conscious devotion and continues as we drift into sleep creates a bridge between our waking spiritual practice and the mystery of sleep, ensuring that our relationship with God encompasses our whole being. In those sacred moments when prayer and sleep intertwine, perhaps we experience a special kind of surrender, entrusting ourselves completely to God's care. Remember this the next time you find the rosary slipping from your fingers as sleep approaches. You haven't failed in prayer, you've simply entered a different dimension of it, one where trust replaces effort and where God continues to work even as you rest in divine love.